All right, we're back. You know, one of the things that I have a problem with here is the way in which we're spending this money. There's no accountability for anything. We were talking about this in the last segment, and I want to continue along this line because where we are in a constitutional crisis is based on the fact that the Constitution is no longer honored or respected or used as a functional guide anymore. And I cannot for the life of me understand why, and I understand that a lot of people have a vested interest in this project or that funding effort and so forth and so on. And everybody screams bloody murder about the wasteful spending and things like that, unless they benefit. Then, of course, they want to rule that, or they want to do a set-aside and allow that particular project to move forward. Well, it's time for Americans to also recognize that each of us individually has to pull our belt in a little bit, too. We have to stop being so willing to fund our own personal thing while we are simultaneously recognizing that by all of our cooperation here, we will dramatically trim and lower our deficit and our costs and our taxation. I think most Americans have lost sight of the fact that one of the reasons we're taxed so heavily is because we've got all this crazy spending and we've got all this debt we have to pay. Well, if you want to lower your taxes, the spending has to go down commensurately. And spending all of this money on all of these wasteful projects is just more than a body can bear. The simple truth is that, we are spending so much money on wasteful government spending that it's kind of frightening that we haven't latched onto that whole thing and said, look, the connection is clear. It's got to stop. We spent, Business Insider has an article out there that shows an example. And it's only one example, guys. There are so many of them, it's impossible to keep track of them all. But they have a report out there which says that we have spent $16 trillion on the most wasteful stuff. This is inefficiency, government waste, and the amount of it is staggering. $28 million was paid out by the Department of Agriculture for inappropriate farm assistance payments. Now, I get it. $28 million is nothing, you say, in the overall scheme of things, but it is something. $67 million was just lost by the IRS that was supposed to be targeted for Obamacare expenses, but was used by IRS agents to fly around and is eaten up in literally travel costs. Some of these IRS people commute daily on a jet, people. It would be cheaper to buy the guy a house. The Conservation Research Program pays millions of dollars annually to farmers who don't even farm on that land. But the USDA went forward and miscalculated the soil rental rate they pay them and wasted $115 million on this one concept and project alone. This isn't, my point is, this isn't limited to stuff that is obvious all the time. A lot of it is hidden spending that is going to grease the skids, if you will. $208 million worth of single-family direct housing loans went to borrowers who had no stable or dependable income, no credit, and were not even expected to be able to make the payments. $208 million. $118 million could be saved through the Department of Labor's troubled Job Corps. The Job Corps, if you're not familiar with that group, it is an utter debacle. And the total number of duplicative programs that are in the federal system are so staggering. You know, Tom, I can't think of his last name. Tom, he's a doctor. Maybe he's not a doctor. I can't think of his last name. He has a whole book out about wasteful spending, and he shows hundreds of billions of dollars. $150 million overpaid in government checks for the Employment and Training Administration. They can't even track down where the money was spent. This is for unemployment insurance claims and employment training and advice on how to get a new job after you've been unemployed. $138 million in federal grants spent by the Philadelphia School District wasn't allowed or justified, but they spent it anyway. $138 million in one city. $300 million is going to be given to Detroit to bail that city out. The Department of Education spent $42.5 million to St. Mary of the Woods College, despite the fact that the school is ineligible to receive any federal funding at all. But they got $42.4 million. Why are we funding private colleges who are charging staggering amounts of money to the students who go? And all of it, by the way, we're paying for as taxpayers because we're guaranteeing those loans. And right now the federal government has taken over all student loans. You can't go to a bank anymore and get a student loan. You have to get it through the federal government. The SBA, the Small Business Administration, has lost $43 million in the last 2 years underwriting loans that they knew would not be paid off. The National Disaster Loan Resolution Company failed to transfer delinquent disaster loans to the Treasury Department and lost $171 million as a result. Now, I get it. You're saying, well, we're talking about $785 billion here. What's $171 million in that context? Well, listen, when you need to go out and buy a new refrigerator, it's a $1,000 refrigerator, right? And you say, well, if I cut back here and I cut back there and we pull a little bit of money together and we throw it in a jar, soon we have $1,000. It's the same example. The Department of Veterans Affairs overspent an estimated $760 million. That's $1 billion right there. The fraud, waste, and abuse is so staggering. They also awarded a $2.5 billion worth of contracts that were supposed to be gone to veteran-owned small businesses, and that turns out they weren't. Now, that may not be money saved, but at least let's direct it towards these veteran-owned small businesses the way they're supposed to be done. Not based on who knows who. The Army wasted $340 million on a contract to maintain these new Stryker vehicles, which don't even exist anymore. $437 million worth of costs at Los Alamos National Laboratory over a 2-year period. That's $215 million per year. The FAA, $157 million because they failed to restructure contracts. If any company did this, I keep hearing these people say, well, the government doesn't run like a business. It needs to run like a business. Department of Transportation, $180 million. And by the way, those bids almost always go to pals and cronies. They never go, or they're never independently, done. $75 million by the Pentagon. $2.5 billion, for the J-Lens. These are those gigantic blimps that are flying over Washington, D.C., scanning with cameras and radar and so forth and so on. $2.5 billion in an audit that could have been redirected to other stuff. And this is an audit by the government itself. There's $2.5 billion of your $785 right there. Department of Health and Human Services, another $2.7 billion. based on waste for Medicaid and Medicare on just wholesale prescription drugs. Just that issue alone. Forget surgeries, forget paying for doctor bills, forget the fraud and the waste and the abuse in that whole arena. $2.7 billion just by negotiating better rates for wholesale prescription drugs. And they failed to do it. $2.7 billion. $1.2 billion for Medicare overpayment in laboratory fees alone. Just laboratory fees. We're not talking about the doctors themselves. $2.9 billion could be saved by Medicare and Medicaid in cost saving measures that they will not implement, even though the list is right there in front of them. A new $750 million embassy in Baghdad. My point, folks, is that there are so many examples that we don't have to really look very hard and very far to find them. I mean, you could literally find this $785 billion, or very, very close to it, without a whole lot of real deep digging. But we're not willing to go there. You know, Thomas Jefferson said, "Single acts of tyranny may be ascribed to the accidental opinion of the day. But a series of oppressions, begun at a distinguished period and pursued unalterably through every change of ministers, to plainly prove a deliberate, systematic plan of reducing us to slavery, is tyranny envisioned." Ladies and gentlemen, what we have right now is exactly that. These aren't single acts of tyranny. These are serial acts of tyranny. A series of intentional oppressions begun at a very distinguished period. You can pretty much pick it all up from early 1900s. 1912 with the creation of the Fed, 1916 with the creation of the IRS, 1917 I think it was, where we passed the 17th Amendment. Over and over and over, acts of oppression and tyranny designed and geared to be intentionally work their will over a long period of time. And they are pursuing unalterably a path through every change of ministers. That was the term he used at his time, but today we would call it our representatives, Congress. And it does prove a deliberate and systematical plan of reducing us to slavery. James Madison said, "The very definition of tyranny is when all powers are gathered under one place." Listen to that. What is that one place? Anyone who didn't guess Washington, D.C., Thomas Jefferson, in the Diffusion of Knowledge Bill, he said, "The most effectual means of preventing the perversion of power into tyranny is to illuminate, as far as practicable, the minds of the people at large, and especially to give them knowledge of those facts which history exhibits, that possessed thereby the experience of the ages and other countries, that may be enabled to show ambition under all its shapes and to prompt and exert their natural powers to defeat its purposes." These people, these men, told us what was going to happen. They warned us by expressing to us and defining to us what tyranny was. James Madison said, the accumulation of all power, legislative, executive, and judiciary, in the same hands, whether of one, a few, or many, and whether hereditary, self-appointed, or elective, may justly be pronounced the very definition of tyranny. Does that not describe our circumstance right now? The accumulation of all power, legislative and executive and judiciary, in the same hands, whether of one or a few or many, and whether by birth, by self-appointment, or by election, is justly pronounced the very definition of tyranny. He covered every base there. All power has been accumulated, legislative, executive, and judiciary, and it is in the same hands. And it is not one, and it's not a few, but it is many, and it's not hereditary, and in some cases it is self-appointed, if you look at executive orders as the example, and in the rest of it, it is elective. But it makes no difference, because what it is the very definition of tyranny. The truth is, we know where we are. America understands it. Yes, there are those who, believe that this is a good path for us. I mean, if you listen to and listen, there are real true ideologues of the left who really think this is the right path to take. I mean, I get it. They're misinformed. They're not nefarious, I don't think. I think they're just ignorant. But irrespective of that, we can't assume, for argument's sake, that that small minority of individuals has the right and the power and the ability and the wherewithal to rule over the rest of us for their own personal gain or to achieve their vision of the world. Sam Adams, in a letter to Richard Henry Lee in 1789, he wrote, "My friend, I want to let you know how deeply I am impressed with a sense of the importance of amendments." And he was talking about constitutional amendments. "That the good people may clearly see the distinction, for there is a distinction between the federal powers vested in Congress and the sovereign authority belonging to the states, which is the palladium, the protection of the private and personal rights of citizens." They were telling us how to solve the problem. Don't have a centralized government. Let the states protect the innocents, the individuals who live under that state's protection. Ben Franklin, I mean, he doesn't get a whole lot of credit for a lot of quotes, but this one is important. "History affords us many instances of the ruin of states by the prosecution of measures ill-suited to the temper and genius of their people." Boy, if that doesn't describe us, I don't know what does. "The ordaining of laws in favor of one part of the nation to the prejudice and oppression of another is certainly the most erroneous and mistaken policy." Does that not define Obamacare as one example? Does that not define what the NSA is doing to us every day? Does that not define the principle of redistribution of wealth that is being perpetrated on the United States of America by the IRS and President Obama directly? I'm going to read it to you again. I want you to listen to it. "The ordaining of law in favor of one part of the nation to the prejudice and oppression of another is certainly the most erroneous and mistaken policy. An equal dispensation of protection, rights, privileges, and advantages is what every part is entitled to and ought to enjoy. These measures never fail to create great and violent jealousies and animosities between the people favored and the people oppressed. Whence a total separation of affections, interests, political obligations, and all manner of connections by which the whole state is weakened. He's exactly right. These measures never fail to create a great and violent jealousy and animosity between the people who are favored and the people who are oppressed, to then take whatever their goods are and favor the others. Alexander Hamilton said about taxation, if duties are too high, they lessen the consumption. In other words, if taxes are too high, people buy less stuff. The collection is eluded, i.e. people work for loopholes or go into black market, and the product to the Treasury is not so great as when they are confined within proper and moderate bounds. This forms a complete barrier against any material oppression of the citizen by taxes of this class, and is itself a natural limitation to the power of imposing them. This is just common sense. You know, I hear the word common sense come out of this president and out of these knuckleheads up on Capitol Hill, and I hear it every day. We need common sense this, common sense that. Here's common sense. If duties and taxes are too high, they lessen consumption, and therefore collection is eluded. And the product to the Treasury is not as great as it could be, because the taxation is not confined within proper and moderate bounds. Here's a Jefferson quote that very, very appropriately covers this argument that, well, and I heard this last night from Jamu Green on Fox News. She was being interviewed, and she kept insisting that this is that Obamacare is the right of the government because it's the law of the land and so forth and so on, right? And everybody just has to accept it and move on. But I have to tell you, Jefferson summed this up real quick in 1801. All too must bear in mind this sacred principle, that though the will of the majority is in all cases to prevail, that will to be rightful must be reasonable, that the minority possess their equal rights as well, which equal law must protect, and to violate that would be oppression. I'm going to read that to you again because I want you to understand that. All too will bear in mind this sacred principle, that though the will of the majority is in all cases to prevail, that will to be rightful must be reasonable, that the minority possess their equal rights, which equal law must protect, and to violate would be oppression. That's the premise of which you've heard me say many, many times over and over again, that the role of government is to protect the smallest minority, the minority of one. You are the smallest minority. I am the smallest minority, to me. The role of government is not to institute grand schemes and plans that draw from some to benefit others. The role of government is to prepare the rightful preservation or protection of the smallest minority. And taking someone's goods for redistribution to another person who doesn't have a rightful claim to possess that good, that is oppression. The truth is, we are at a point right now where government has become the oppressor of the people. We now are responsive to government instead of government being responsive to us. We are turned into desperate dependents of the government. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the problem. Once we become dependent, we no longer have independence, and we no longer are capable of making rational decisions in an objective format. We now make decisions subjectively, based upon our own personal benefit and need. That's what's failing to be taught in our schools. That's what's failing to be taught in our homes. That your personal me does not override the general basis or conception for the entire nation. Your desire for things or services or whatever it is in large part entirely up to you. It is not the government's job to take from others to provide that which you are unwilling to go out and earn for yourself. Every nation throughout all known history has had its poor, have had its indigent who needed support and help. And this has got to be the most generous nation in the history of mankind. And I dare say that most people would willingly participate in the programs that would assist those who are truly in need. But it should be handled locally, where there's some accountability. It should be handled outside of government's purview, because it's not government's job. Everyone comes in here buck naked with the same rights, responsibilities, duties, and obligations. Every one of us. Those who are willing to shirk their duty and responsibility in order to game the system are not entitled to anything. I recognize that there are people who need assistance. They're mentally incapacitated, in many cases physically incapacitated. But it is not government's job to sit there and draw off the wealth of the vast portion of the nation to serve those who are not really truly worthy, but are simply gaming the system for their own benefit. And that's where we are today. A nation of people gaming the system for their own benefit. Did you know, just as a quick aside, we have currently in the United States, and I'm pulling this number off the debt clock, we right now the people that are disabled on SSI, we have 14.262 million of them. But I'm going to tell you something. I'm going to show you a little statistic that'll blow your mind. There's a function on the U.S. debt clock that takes you back a period, and you can pick it. And I'm going to go to 2000. In 2000, we only had 8 million people, 8.5 million people on disability. Now we have 14.3 on disability. Is it truly possible that in only 13 years, the nation has increased the total number of disabled people by 6 million people? Almost doubled? Of course not. But what these people are looking for is a free ride. Now, I'm saying there are some disabled people, truly disabled. but there are a lot who are not. And they're using it for lifelong unemployment. In 2000, the number of people that lived in poverty was 31 million. Today, it's 47 million. How can 13 years make such a vast difference? In 2000, 17 million people, and I'm rounding up, by the way, 17 million people were on food stamps. 13 years later, it's 48 million. Ladies and gentlemen, that's a 31 million person increase, or recipient increase. Not people, but recipients, which is feeding entire families. I don't believe for a minute that 31 million people, or literally 3 times the number of people that were originally on food stamps back in 2000, are all qualified to receive food stamps. I don't buy it. I just don't buy it. It's not true. All right, we're got to wrap because it's a hard break. We're going to take a break. When we come back, we're going to talk about President Reagan, and I'm going to talk with you a little bit about something which he said, which I find to be very, very informative and educational, and I think it's directly related to where we are in our nation today. So stick with us for this break. When we return, I'm going to talk to you about a speech he made that was back in, I believe it was 1964. And it was a stump speech that he gave. And he gave it, I'll get into the details with you, but it was done in 1964 at a Barry Goldwater presidential campaign. But I got to tell you something. This is probably one of the most accurate statements for our current situation today that you could hear from a historical figure. You're listening to America's Voice Now. Find us on the web at americasvoicenow.org, facebook.com/America's Voice Now, and our YouTube channel at youtube.com/America's Voice Now. You can also catch this show streaming live on our web every day from 8 to 10 a.m. Central Time at americasvoicenow.org. We'll be right back.